More than 3,000 years ago, one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth simply stopped existing. And for over a century, nobody could agree on what actually happened to the people who built it. Now, ancient DNA pulled directly from their bones and teeth is finally answering a question that pottery, palaces, and ruined frescoes never could. Who were the Minoans, really? Where did they come from? And what does their genetic code reveal about why they eventually vanished from history? If you've never heard the name before, the Minoans were the people behind one of Europe's very first great civilizations, built on the island of Crete starting around 4,000 years ago. They constructed massive multi-story palaces at places like Knossos, developed one of the earliest writing systems in Europe, and left behind vivid, colorful frescoes, showing bull-leaping ceremonies, dolphins, and elegant, richly dressed figures that look almost startlingly modern. For decades, archaeologists could describe what the Minoans built and how they lived in incredible detail. What they couldn't answer, no matter how many ruins they excavated, was the much simpler question of where these people actually came from in the first place. The story of how the Minoans were even rediscovered in the first place is worth pausing on, because for thousands of years they were essentially erased from written history entirely. Unlike the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians, the Minoans left behind no lengthy historical narratives that later civilizations could reference and preserve. What survived instead were fragmented Greek myths, stories about King Minos, a labyrinth beneath his palace, and a monstrous half-man, half-bull creature called the Minotaur locked away inside it. For centuries, most scholars assumed these were simply fantastical Greek legends with no real historical basis whatsoever. That changed dramatically in 1900, when British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans began excavating a massive complex of ruins at Knossos on Crete, uncovering a sprawling multi-room palace so architecturally complex that Evans himself became convinced he had found the physical inspiration behind the ancient labyrinth myth. He named the civilization he'd uncovered after the mythical King Minos, and the term Minoan has stuck ever since, even though we still don't actually know what these people called themselves. That question sat unresolved for the better part of a century, mostly because bones and pottery can only tell you so much. You can measure a skull, study burial customs, and compare artistic styles all day long and still end up with nothing more than educated guesswork about ancestry. DNA changed that completely because, unlike a piece of broken pottery, DNA carries an actual physical record of who a person's ancestors were, going back generation after generation, written directly into their cells. The first major breakthrough came in 2013, when a team of researchers extracted and analyzed mitochondrial DNA from 37 Minoan skeletons recovered from a cave burial site on the Lassithi Plateau in eastern Crete. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively from the mother, which means it acts like an unbroken thread tracing maternal ancestry back through countless generations, making it one of the most reliable tools scientists have for tracking where a population originally came from. What that 2013 study found put an end to one of the most persistent theories about Minoan origins, a theory that had lingered in both popular imagination and some academic circles for years. Because the Minoans were so advanced, some early researchers speculated they might have descended from Egyptian or North African populations, imagining some kind of sophisticated migration across the Mediterranean that brought civilization to Crete from Africa. The DNA told a completely different story. None of the Minoan samples carried the genetic markers typically associated with African populations, and when researchers compared their mitochondrial variations against more than 100 modern and ancient population groups, the genetic trail led firmly toward Europe instead. The closest genetic relatives of the Minoans turned out to be Neolithic farmers, the same early agricultural populations that had spread across Europe roughly 9,000 years ago, arriving from Anatolia and gradually settling the Mediterranean islands, including Crete itself. In other words, the Minoans weren't outsiders who arrived from some distant, more advanced culture bringing civilization with them. They were essentially homegrown, descendants of the very first farmers to settle Crete thousands of years earlier, who then built one of history's most sophisticated societies from within, using their own labor, ingenuity, and geographic isolation on a Mediterranean island to their advantage. That single finding reframed the entire story of European civilization. It suggested that the roots of one of the continent's earliest advanced cultures weren't imported from somewhere else entirely. They grew directly out of the same population that had been quietly farming the Cretan landscape for thousands of years before anyone ever laid the first stone of a palace at Knossos. But mitochondrial DNA, as powerful as it is, only tells half the story, because it only traces the maternal line. To get a fuller picture of Minoan ancestry, researchers needed whole genome data, the kind that captures inheritance from both parents and reveals a much richer, more complete portrait of a population's genetic history. That breakthrough arrived in 2017 when a team led by researchers from Harvard Medical School, the Max Planck Institute, and the University of Washington published genome-wide data recovered from 19 ancient individuals, including Minoans from Crete, Mycenaeans from mainland Greece, and Bronze Age individuals from southwestern Anatolia. Extracting usable DNA from remains this old is notoriously difficult, especially in a warm Mediterranean climate where heat and humidity tend to degrade genetic material far faster than in colder regions of the world. Getting clean, reliable genome data out of teeth that had been sitting in Cretan soil for 3,500 years was, by itself, a remarkable technical achievement. It's worth understanding just how technically difficult this kind of work actually is, because it explains why these breakthroughs took so long to arrive in the first place. DNA degrades over time, breaking down into smaller and smaller fragments the longer it sits buried in the ground, and heat, humidity, and microbial activity all accelerate that breakdown dramatically. The Mediterranean is one of the worst possible environments for ancient DNA preservation on the entire planet, which is exactly why so much of the pioneering ancient DNA research of the past 2 decades focused instead on colder regions like Siberia, Scandinavia, and the steppes of Central Asia, where genetic material survives in far better condition. Successfully pulling usable, reliable genome data out of 3,500-year-old teeth recovered from a warm Cretan cave meant researchers had to work with incredibly small, fragmented traces of genetic material, cross-checking their results obsessively against modern contamination, since a single stray skin cell from a careless researcher can easily overwhelm and corrupt an ancient sample. The fact that this data exists at all today represents years of refined laboratory technique, purpose-built specifically to coax genuine signal out of some of the most challenging archaeological samples on Earth. The results confirmed what the earlier mitochondrial study had suggested, but added an entirely new layer of complexity to the picture. Minoans and Mycenaeans, it turned out, were genetically very similar to one another, both descending largely from early Neolithic farming populations that had spread across the Aegean thousands of years earlier. But they weren't identical, and the differences between them turned out to be just as revealing as the similarities. Both groups carried a certain amount of what researchers call Eastern ancestry, genetic signatures connected to populations from the Caucasus region and areas near ancient Iran, a component that likely arrived in the Aegean through a previously unknown migration event that predates recorded history entirely. Where the two groups diverged was in a second ancestral component. The Mycenaeans, the mainland Greek civilization that would eventually eclipse the Minoans, carried an additional genetic signature linked to the Eurasian steppe, the vast grassland region stretching from the Black Sea into Central Asia, home to nomadic pastoralist populations who migrated into Europe during the Bronze Age. The Minoans, by contrast, showed no trace of this steppe ancestry whatsoever. Despite being geographically close to the mainland, despite sharing so much of their deeper ancestry with the Mycenaeans, the population of Crete remained genetically untouched by the wave of steppe migration that swept across much of the rest of Bronze Age Europe. That detail might sound like a small technical footnote, but it actually carries enormous implications. It suggests that Crete's island geography did more than just shape Minoan culture, architecture, and trade. It genetically isolated the population in a measurable way, protecting them from a demographic wave that transformed much of the rest of the continent during roughly the same window of time. While mainland populations were absorbing new genetic ancestry from migrating steppe herders, the Minoans stayed on their island, continuing to build on the same genetic and cultural foundation they had maintained for thousands of years already. This genetic distinction between Minoans and Mycenaeans also lines up with something completely different angle, the written record itself. Or more accurately, the mystery of the written record. The Minoans developed a writing system known as Linear A, which researchers can read phonetically but still cannot fully translate because it doesn't match any known language family. The Mycenaeans, on the other hand, used a related script called Linear B, which was famously deciphered in the 1950s and turned out to be an early form of Greek. That linguistic gap has puzzled historians for decades. If the Minoans and Mycenaeans were culturally connected and geographically close, why did they end up speaking and writing in what appear to be two entirely different, unrelated languages? The DNA evidence offers at least a partial answer. These were related but genuinely distinct populations, shaped by different ancestral inputs and different histories of migration, even while sharing deep, overlapping roots in the same corner of the ancient world. Now here's where the story becomes even more relevant to people living today, because DNA research hasn't just clarified where the Minoans came from, it has also revealed what happened to their genetic legacy after their civilization collapsed. The Minoan world didn't end quickly or all at once. Around the 16th century BCE, the nearby island of Thera, known today as Santorini, erupted in one of the most powerful volcanic events in recorded human history, an explosion so massive it likely triggered tsunamis, ash fallout, and years of disrupted weather patterns across the eastern Mediterranean. For a long time, popular explanations pointed to the single eruption as the definitive cause of the Minoan collapse, a tidy, dramatic story of a civilization wiped out in one catastrophic moment. The archaeological evidence tells a messier, more gradual story. Crete's northern coastline shows relatively limited direct damage from the eruption itself, and Minoan civilization actually continued for more than a century afterward, even experiencing a kind of cultural resurgence as palaces were rebuilt and trade networks recovered. What eventually brought the Minoan world to its knees wasn't one single blow, but a slow accumulation of pressure. The Thera eruption disrupted maritime trade routes that Minoan wealth had always depended on, weakening their economic position at a moment when the rising Mycenaean civilization on the mainland was actively expanding its own influence across the Aegean. Around 1450 BCE, the major administrative palaces across Crete, everywhere except Knossos itself, were destroyed. And shortly afterward, Linear B, the Mycenaean Greek script, begins appearing in the archaeological record on Crete for the first time. That combination of evidence points strongly toward a Mycenaean takeover, whether through direct military conquest, opportunistic political absorption, or some combination of both, rather than a single volcanic apocalypse wiping the Minoans off the map in one dramatic afternoon. This is exactly the kind of nuance ancient DNA is now able to help clarify, layering hard genetic evidence on top of the archaeological guesswork that dominated this field for most of the 20th century. It also helps to place the Minoan story inside the much bigger picture of what was happening across the entire eastern Mediterranean during this same general era. The Minoans weren't the only advanced Bronze Age civilization to eventually fall apart. Around 1200 BCE, in the century or so after the Mycenaeans had already absorbed Crete, an even larger, more mysterious wave of collapse swept across the entire region, an event historians now simply call the Bronze Age collapse. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia disintegrated. Mycenaean palaces on the Greek mainland were burned and abandoned. Egypt, though it survived, was permanently weakened, fighting off waves of seaborne raiders that ancient Egyptian records referred to only vaguely as the Sea Peoples. Trade networks that had connected the entire eastern Mediterranean for centuries simply stopped functioning almost overnight, plunging much of the region into what archaeologists sometimes describe as a genuine dark age, a period of reduced population, lost literacy, and cultural memory loss so severe that even the Greeks themselves eventually forgot how to read the Linear B script their own ancestors had once used. Seen against that backdrop, the fall of Minoan Crete wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was one early tremor in a much larger civilizational earthquake that would eventually topple nearly every major power structure in the region. So did the Minoans actually disappear, in the sense most people imagine when they hear that word? The genetic evidence suggests the answer is more complicated and honestly more interesting than a simple story of extinction. Minoan civilization, as a distinct political and cultural entity, absolutely did collapse, swallowed up by Mycenaean expansion and the slow erosion of the trade, networks that had sustained it for centuries. But the actual people, the population itself, didn't vanish from the genetic record the way the word disappeared might imply. Modern researchers comparing ancient Minoan and Mycenaean DNA against present-day Greek populations have found clear genetic continuity stretching from the Bronze Age all the way to today, though it isn't a perfectly clean, unbroken line. Modern Greeks share somewhat more genetic ancestry with the Mycenaeans than with the Minoans specifically, and they carry noticeably diluted levels of the deep Neolithic ancestry that define both Bronze Age populations, a signal of thousands of years of subsequent migration, invasion, and mixing across the eastern Mediterranean in the centuries and millennia that followed. That dilution effect actually makes sense once you consider everything that happened across the region after the Bronze Age ended. Greece experienced wave after wave, subsequent contact and migration from the poorly understood upheavals of the broader Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, which brought down civilizations across the entire eastern Mediterranean almost simultaneously through the Classical era, the Roman period, Byzantine rule, and beyond. Each of those historical chapters left its own genetic fingerprint layered on top of what came before, gradually diluting but never fully erasing that original deep ancestry, connecting back to the first Neolithic farmers who settled Crete 9,000 years ago. In a very real sense, the Minoans didn't vanish so much as they were absorbed, genetically diffused into the much larger, much more complicated population history of the entire Aegean world, a process that continued for thousands of years after their palaces first fell silent. There's also a modern twist to this story that ties everything back to the present day in a surprisingly direct way. In the summer of 2026, researchers published new genome comparisons drawn from teeth recovered across multiple archaeological sites in mainland Greece and Mycenae, expanding the genetic dataset even further and reinforcing the same core conclusion that earlier studies had already pointed toward. Modern Greek populations really do carry a measurable direct genetic thread back to these Bronze Age civilizations, a connection that isn't just symbolic or cultural, but literally written into the DNA of people living in that region today. That kind of continuity is genuinely rare on this scale. Plenty of regions around the world have experienced so much migration, conquest, and population replacement over the last 3,000 years that any direct genetic link to their Bronze Age inhabitants has been thoroughly scrambled or erased entirely. Greece, it turns out, is one of the places where that ancient thread somehow survived, thinned out and diluted by thousands of years of subsequent history, but never fully broken. There's something genuinely moving about this when you actually sit with it for a moment. For most of the 20th century, the Minoans existed almost entirely as an archaeological abstraction, known through broken pottery, faded frescoes, and the ruins of palaces that archaeologists like Sir Arthur Evans spent careers piecing back together stone by stone. DNA has done something those artifacts alone never could. It has reconnected an ancient, half-mythologized civilization directly to the living population of modern Greece, using nothing more than a few carefully preserved teeth and bones pulled from a cave burial site and a Bronze Age settlement. That's not just a technical achievement in a laboratory somewhere. It's a genuinely emotional bridge between the present and a civilization that most people previously only encountered through myths about the Minotaur and half-remembered stories of a lost, mysterious island culture. Before we go any further, if ancient DNA and lost civilizations are the kind of thing you find genuinely fascinating, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive like this one. It's also worth pointing out just how much this entire field has changed in only about a decade. That first Minoan mitochondrial DNA study back in 2013 was considered a major breakthrough, simply for successfully extracting usable genetic material from bones that old preserved in the notoriously difficult conditions of a warm Mediterranean climate. By 2017, researchers weren't just extracting DNA anymore, they were comparing whole genomes across 19 ancient individuals against nearly 3,000 other genetic samples, both ancient and modern, drawing conclusions about migration patterns, population mixing, and ancestral origins with a level of precision that would have been almost unimaginable a generation earlier. And the pace of this kind of research hasn't slowed down since. Newer studies continue, refining the picture, comparing broader samples of Minoan and Mycenaean remains against modern Greek populations, adding more genetic data points that sharpen exactly how much continuity actually exists between the Bronze Age Aegean and the people living in that same region today. What makes this particular chapter of ancient DNA research stand out isn't just the technical achievement, though that alone is impressive enough. It's what the findings actually mean for how we understand the deep roots of European civilization as a whole. The Minoans weren't outsiders who imported culture and sophistication from somewhere else, and they weren't wiped from existence in some single dramatic catastrophe, the way popular imagination often frames it. They were a genuinely homegrown Mediterranean population, descended from farmers who had been living on Crete for thousands of years, who built something extraordinary using nothing but their own resources, their own creativity, and the natural advantages of their island home. And when their political world eventually did collapse, worn down by volcanic disruption, economic pressure, and ultimately conquest from the mainland, their genetic legacy didn't disappear along with their palaces. It simply folded into the much longer, much larger story of the people who continued living on that same stretch of Mediterranean coastline, generation after generation, all the way down to the present day. That's really the quiet, powerful takeaway sitting underneath all of this genetic data. Civilizations rise and civilizations fall, sometimes slowly over a century of gradual decline, and sometimes there really is a single dramatic turning point historians can point to. But the people behind those civilizations, the actual human beings whose lives filled in the space between the archaeological headlines, rarely vanish as completely as the history books sometimes make it sound. Their DNA stays behind, quietly embedded in the population that follows, waiting patiently in bones and teeth for thousands of years until the right laboratory technique finally comes along to read the story written inside it. In the case of the Minoans, that story turned out to be less about disappearance and more about transformation. A civilization that fell, but whose people, in a very real and measurable genetic sense, never actually left.